Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Question 17, this is an interesting one. Who wins or loses Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in 2020? So they asked me to kind of rank. Now, very key, these forecasts were all made New Year's Eve. So even though the articles were published later, the forecasts were made New Year's Eve and I recorded them. This was before Qasem Soleimani was killed by a U.S. airstrike on January 2nd. So a lot of these forecasts reflect a knowledge that I had that Soleimani was still an actor. And so what I predicted was that Saudi Arabia would lose the most because he'd be pinned in Yemen and they'd have no strategic counter to Soleimani. That forecast lasted 2 days. Iran struggled to hold its gains in a quandary of having expanded past its reach, and Turkey gained the most by establishing a regional hegemony over near neighbors like Syria and as far west as Libya. So this forecast is interesting. The death of Soleimani, people misunderestimate this. They think it was just like you took out a military leader. It changed the landscape in the Middle East. And I'm going to say it on the air here, so if you're a Trump fan and I never say anything good about him, you can clip this and play it to all your friends and say I'm a big Trump supporter or whatever. The move to kill Soleimani was a ballsy move that I don't think many presidents would have taken. I think there were very good causes for it. I tend to look at what Soleimani, and I wrote a big article on this, what he was doing in Syria, his interventionist policies around the region destabilizing. He had led a twin-pronged effort to encircle the Gulf Community Cooperation, which is all the Arab states, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, stuff like that. He'd been encircling them, and that meant he was active in Yemen. That means that he was active with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They were very active, huge intervention in Syria. I mean, and even across northern Iraq, they were controlling the PMCs. This was the guy, like you're talking about Prussia on the verge of unification into Germany and taking out Bismarck. So that one move changed everything overnight. Now, it didn't change the nature of the forecast, but it did change where these countries fall. Without Soleimani, I mean, Iran was really struggling. It had expanded probably farther than it needed to and was pinned down in these really things. And then without Soleimani, I mean, you really got to see the limits of Iranian power. There was the retaliation that came a week or two after Soleimani. I was predicting it wouldn't be a big retaliation. It was a couple token rocket strikes into Iraq. Unfortunately, the biggest military casualty they were able to inflict was they shot down their own passenger plane right outside of, this was a horrible tragedy that was self-inflicted by the Iranian military. That led to a lot of recriminations. They had protests. They're faring a lot worse in the pandemic than Turkey. When you think about regional powers, this pandemic's going to have a leavening effect. And who does better? Well, Turkey's doing much better than Iran in terms of the pandemic. And so really, Iran dropped to the bottom. And the bottom came out from Iran this year. They still don't have a counter. They don't have they don't have an ex-Soleimani. There's no person to replace him. And I'm not trying to overplay that history is written by individual great men, but Soleimani was a pretty unique individual. And I think losing him in the leadership core, you've lost the control of the PMCs in Iraq. They're running amok. So Iran is the one who lost the most. That didn't mean Saudi Arabia did any better. It just stayed in the bad spot it was, and Iran went worse. And then certainly I think the forecast where I nailed it very accurately is that Turkey would become a regional hegemon. And I think in some ways you can, let's just go through what happened. Turkey in the last year has fought 3 wars with Russia. One of them was mano a mano in Syria. 2 of them were proxy wars. So Syria, Libya, and the Armenian Azerbaijan. Turkey's won all 3. That is a big deal that not many people are talking about. Turkey has waged 3 proxy wars, and it's defining the extent of its regional sphere of influence. And we can look at this, right? Back to the map. Woo, here we go. Zoom. Here's Turkey, right? Here's Turkey. Here's Russia up here, right? Big Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So you see, these 3 are all in close proximity. Saudi Arabia down here. Turkey won a war in Syria against Russia. It won a proxy war in Libya against Russia, and it won a proxy war in Armenia, Azerbaijan against Russia. Iran was not involved in any of those conflicts. If Iran's going to be a player, it had the aspirations to be a player on this regional stage. It's out of the game. It's Russia and Turkey right now carving up what's left. Furthermore, Iran hasn't been able to pull out of Syria. It still thinks it can make some magic happen. Part of what Iran's strategy was that Soleimani was pushing is they were going to build a heavy railroad across northern Iraq into Syria and link it up with, zoom in here, Latakia. Oop, here we go. Latakia, which is, and I always get these wrong, there's Tartus and Latakia. I believe Latakia is the Iranian Navy base and Tartus is the Russian naval base. These are big naval bases. They wanted to have a railroad that would come across the north of Syria and link to Latakia. And this is Soleimani's grand strategy. His grand strategy, I talked about encircling. He wanted to encircle the Gulf through the north, and he wanted to encircle it through the south. And what he wanted to do by here is get a strategic rail line that would end up in Latakia, that you could have heavy rail end up an Iranian naval base and completely bypass the choke point of the Suez Canal. This would have made Iran a Mediterranean open sea player. But when Soleimani got taken out, that ended that. And unfortunately for Iran, they're still stuck in Syria, and they're trying to play around, and every time they move, Israel's just pounding them with air attacks. So Israel has basically carte blanche ability to operate in Syria. No one seems to be able to stop them. And they launch these air raids periodically, targeting Iranian capabilities, whether they're transferring weapons to Hezbollah or they're gathering strength in this Latakia area. Israel's attacking them in Syria with these periodic airstrikes. So Iran's just really struggling. But yeah, Turkey, sorry, I got on a tangent with Iran there. Turkey is, you have the 3 regional wars that they've won. Erdogan still has strong support, domestic support. He's playing to a kind of Turkish nationalism when it comes to this Mediterranean conflict over oil. There's a grievance that basically goes back and says, hey, the way you define coastlines and territorial control on coastlines unfairly penalizes Turkey, so we're not going to play by those rules. And he's now making moves to seize oil fields in the Mediterranean. It's actually survived COVID-19 better than many European countries. I was looking this up earlier. There's a little bit of oddness in that Turkey announced recently 800,000 cases on one day. I haven't been able to find out what's going on with that. Science Decoded made, but you look at it and it goes, here's COVID, and then it spikes up to the super high number. And Turkey's approach to regional hegemony is a lot different than Soleimani. Soleimani went in hard and heavy. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of Baji mercenaries hired from Afghanistan, flown to Syria, Quds forces on the ground. Turkey's is a lot different. Turkey's approach to these proxy wars is often relying on local partners, but they equip them with very high-end technology and drones. Turkish military drone technology is probably some of the best proven state-on-state drone. I mean, U.S. has good drone technology, but it hasn't been used in state-on-state conflicts yet. Turkey's been used on several conflicts now, and it's spanked Russia every time it's come up against it. This new, if you want to see how modern wars are being fought, look at Armenia, Azerbaijan, and what's going on. And so this is a much lighter approach for Turkey. They can establish their regional hegemony and have their sphere of influence, but don't have to bog themselves down with deploying tens of thousands of troops. Now they do have troops. They have special forces deployed in Azerbaijan for peacekeeping. They have trainers in Libya. They obviously have a military presence in the corridor that they've partitioned a third of Syria. So overall, Turkey is doing the best, and that forecast was pretty much on the money. What difference would there be in current Turkey events if they had been let into NATO 20 years ago? That's a really good question. 20 years ago, I got to do math. That'd be 2000. So that was before Erdogan. Or President Erdogan, he was in the Justice Party and was coming into power. He was elected in 2003. So this is before Erdogan. There may have been, let's say they get, wait a minute, you said let into NATO. You mean European Union. Turkey's been part of NATO for a long time. So Turkey's, let's clear the board. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a military alliance. Turkey has been part of that for decades. The European Union, this collection of European states, common currency, common economic, no customs. Turkey has been trying to get in that for decades. And there was always barriers against it of allowing them in, humanitarian concerns, their treatment of Kurds, things like that. And over time, Turkey began to feel like, hey, what's the deal? Are you going to let us in or not? And they really began souring on it. And part of that souring on it, I think, led to the rise of the Justice Party, which led to the rise of Erdogan. Now, I'm not going to say whether that would have been curtailed, that you would get a scenario where you wouldn't have Erdogan rise in Turkey. And I think, even if they were part of the EU, Erdogan is, the personality of Erdogan and his Justice Party is significantly different from what the status quo of Turkey was. It's not just about EU. It's about whether the military effectively controls civilian government. They purged the military, first thing they did, and took control of the military, to now the military is subservient to the government. We would think that's a good thing in the US. That's kind of the normal order of things. In Turkey, however, for most of their modern history, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the military has prevented sort of radical, or not radical, but nationalist Islam from taking hold. The Justice Party is very much an Islamic party, and they push back on that. I think you would have seen Erdogan and the EU eventually come to, an unhappy state, kind of like Hungary is now. And sometimes you have like these issues in the EU over migrants, immigrants and refugees coming out of the Syrian war, where there's a lot of tension between EU partners. Would they still be in the EU now? I'm not sure. When you have ISIS comes up, with the Syria war happens, there's a unique opportunity for Turkey to reassert regional hegemony. And everyone comes to the table. Iran comes to the table, Turkey comes to the table, Russia comes to the table, the US wanders around the table, draws some red lines, erases the red lines, pretends it's not an issue, and then comes back later when ISIS rises and is late to the table. I think that would have drawn it in. And once that happens, between the Arab Spring and the Syria war, these conditions are ripe for Turkey to exert a sort of regional hegemony they haven't had since the Ottoman Empire. And I think you're seeing they made a push in the Arab Spring that fell apart on them. They were sort of the odd man out for a long time, but in the last 2 years, they've really turned it around and are now expanding and pushing those boundaries. So thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.